This is an act which laid down the foundation for Government of India, because Governor-General came to be addressed as Governor-General of India. This is an act which established law commission, introduced a law member, and laid down the basis for codification of law. In fact, this was a law, this was an act which introduced education policy and even removed disqualification under Section 87. Before we study this very important act, let us generalize the developments that have taken place till date and how this act was a landmark as compared to the previous acts. So, if we consider 1773, that is the regulating act, up till the Charter Act of 1833, we can say that the time period from 1773 up till the Pitt's India Act of 1784. So we have regulating act, we have discussed this in detail. We have the Pitt's India Act, we have the Charter Act. Let us say this is 1793. We have the Charter Act, and 1813 we have the Charter Act, followed by the 1833 Charter Act. When the first regulating act of 1773 was introduced, the Britishers, they pursued a policy of reverse acculturation. That is, the Britishers, they wanted to learn Indian languages. They wanted to learn the customs, traditions, laws, and they wanted to Indianize themselves. So Warren Hastings, during his time period, we saw establishment of Calcutta Madrasa in 1781. Sir William Jones established Asiatic Society of Bengal. Indian texts were translated into English language. Abhijanan Shakuntalam, Bhagavad Gita, Manusmriti, they all were translated into English languages. In fact, the English, they claimed that both Hindus and the British, Indians and the British, they had a common ancestry. And attempts were made by the British to claim a common heritage. This ideology or this time period, which was characterized by Orientalist approach, witnessed an attempt by the British to understand the native customs, language and tradition. And here, this Orientalism, it produced knowledge of India to suit the objectives of English. However, in 1784, when the Pitt's India Act was passed, followed by advent of Lord Cornwallis in 1786, the British started holding Indian custom, tradition, knowledge in contempt, or rather, a distorted idea of India, distorted knowledge of India which Orientalism produced. This was used by the British to look down upon Indians. So after 1784, especially after 1786 and 1790s, the Britishers, they claimed superiority. Lord Cornwallis championed this claim of superiority. And He is known for upholding an ideology which is known as Anglicism, Anglicization. So Lord Cornwallis, via Charter Act of 1793, he will pass a resolution that all superior services above £500 per year, they would be reserved only for European covenant servants. So Indians, they were considered unfit to occupy higher services, positions of authority. So the idea of white man supremacy was something that characterized the Charter Act of 1793. Anglicization. And during this time period, the Britishers, with this racial discrimination, with the claim of racial superiority, with the power that they appropriated, they inflicted immense exploitation, oppression upon the subject population. And their approach was different. They justified this oppression, claiming a poor nature, a poor opinion about Indian character. They justified that Indians, they only knew one rule, that is despotism. They claimed because they had prepared, they had given to themselves a distorted knowledge of India's past, and they claimed that India and entire Asia, entire Orient was characterized by darkness, and the white man is given a burden by the providence so as to emancipate these people from darkness, which they called as white man burden. So this was the white man burden. It formed the characteristic feature of Anglicist ideology. This Anglicism was intertwined with company's objective. However, by the 1800s onwards, we see there was Christian humanism. There were Christian humanists who were sympathetic to the cause of Indians. But even here, they based all their knowledge on the distorted view of India, and they claimed that only when Indians will be converted to Christianity will the Indians be emancipated from the darkness. So whereas Anglicist ideology claimed despotism to emancipate Indians from the darkness, and evangelical, they claimed that propagation of Christianity was a must to emancipate them from the darkness. And this ideology, it found expression in the Charter Act of 1813, as we have discussed, whereby the Christian missionaries were allowed to propagate Christianity. In fact, it was under the influence of Christian missionaries that the Charter Act of 1813, it contained a provision whereby 1 lakh rupee was set aside so as to promote native learning, promotion of science, and other Western learning. By the time we move 1820s and 30s, we see considerable change happening in England. The Industrial Revolution, which gained firm control in 1780s and 90s, witnessed a capitalist mode of production, rise of a middle class, which wanted a free market to exist so that they could have more access to greater markets. In the beginning of 19th century, with Industrial Revolution gaining, strengthening over a period of time, capitalist mode of production strengthening over a period of time, by 1820s we saw the middle class came to support or came to promote reforms. The entire English Parliament was divided between the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories were conservative, they were resistant towards reforms, and the Whigs, they were liberals who wanted reforms. And this movement in 1820s ultimately found expression in the form of Reform Act of 1832. Via Reform Act of 1832, there were reforms that were introduced in England. There was enfranchisement of new sections of society. There were upholding of ideas of liberalism, utilitarianism, and this Reform Act of 1832 also greatly influenced the Charter Act of 1833. This Charter Act of 1833 was the product of two important individuals. One was Lord Macaulay, other was James Mill. Both were utilitarians. So we need to understand the utilitarian ideology before we proceed ahead with Charter Act of 1833. Utilitarianism as a school of thought is an offshoot of liberalism as compared to the conservative school of thought, which upheld tradition, which upheld customs. Utilitarianism, it developed a calculus to measure every aspect of life. So utilitarianism claimed that the ultimate objective of the government should be to secure the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So every aspect of life was to be calculated quantitatively via utilitarian calculus. Utilitarianism believed in equality of humankind. It believed in liberal principles. It believed in the right to life, liberty, and property. And utilitarian principles advocated an active intervention of the state to make sure that every individual enjoyed the life, liberty, and property. James Mill was one of the ardent proponent of this utilitarian school of thought. And with utilitarianism emphasizing that a state must play a proactive role in initiating reforms, the Charter Act of 1833 itself was characterized by reforms, and it promoted certain ideas of reforms as well. In fact, only after Charter Act of 1833 we will see socio-cultural reforms like abolition of thuggy. There would also be abolition of slavery. So this was all the outcome of the utilitarian principles, which were the basic character of the Charter Act of 1833. So let us study some of the prominent features of this Charter Act. I've already explained that there are four prominent pressure groups, I would say four prominent sections back in England. There are the free traders, or those who wanted free markets. Second, there were companies, shareholders. Third, there were evangelicals. And we also see that there was also a certain form of necessity of the British Parliament with respect to administration. Now, these free traders who had not gained much during the Charter Act of 1813 gained massively in the Charter Act of 1833. The free traders in the Charter Act of 1833 were allowed to trade in India. That is, all forms of restrictions were removed. So the free traders, they can trade, acquire property, and even immigrate to India. It means the company's monopoly was done away with completely. So the Charter Act of 1833 did away with companies' monopoly altogether. Even companies' monopoly with China trade was also withdrawn. The tea trade with China was also withdrawn. The company was told to close all its commercial activities, and it was supposed to restrict itself to only administrative and political activities, political domain. However, the interests of companies' shareholders were safeguarded. The company's shareholders, they were given 10.5% dividend. Till the time the company's stock would be purchased at 200% rate. So the time period was not specified. The British Parliament stated that now the company, it is being asked to stop all its commercial activities. So whatever stock would be remaining with the company, it would be purchased at 200% rate, either by the private traders, private companies, or companies back at home. Till that time period, the shareholders, they would be given a 10.5% dividend. So the shareholders of the company was also safeguarded. Thirdly, we have seen evangelicals, they were already allowed to promote Christianity in India after the Charter Act of 1813. But the most important aspect was by the British Parliament. When the British Parliament introduced a series of reforms, what it did, it extended the company's occupation in India for another 20 years. So a 20 years time period was given to the company. So under the Charter Act of 1833, the company was said that your charter is renewed for another 20 years, but over here the company was working in India or was managing as a trust of the British Parliament. Now it was not a private company anymore. So they did extend the company's tenure for 20 years, but this was not the same charter as that of 1793 or the charter that was same of to a partial nature by Charter Act of 1813. The Charter Act of 1833 was quite different as compared to the previous two charters. The major component of the Charter Act of 1833 was the internal administration of the company in India. The Governor-General of Bengal was made Governor-General of India. That is, now there would be a separate government of India. Previously, what used to happen? There were three presidencies, the Calcutta, Madras and Bombay presidency. They used to have governors. There was Governor of Calcutta presidency, Governor of Bombay presidency, Governor of Madras presidency. The previous acts, they had made the Governor of Bengal a superintendent over other two presidencies. But this Charter Act of 1833 now made the Governor-General of Bengal the Governor-General of India. That is, it took away all the powers of the governors of Madras, Bombay, and even that of Bengal, because now there would be a Governor-General of India. And who was the first Governor-General of India? It was Lord William Bentinck. And we have already studied the Charter Act of 1793, where number of councillors, they were reduced to 3. So now with Governor-General of India being made and having a council, so Governor-General in council of 3, there was one more addition, a law member was added in the Governor-General in council. But see, look at the manner in which this reform was introduced. The Charter Act of 1793, it had reduced the councillor from 4 to 3, so that the Governor General, he could have a advantage in case of a tie. He needed only support of one member. And now with the Charter Act of 1833 increasing the councillor again to 4, the fourth one was not like other councillor. The fourth one was a law member. So we will see fourth councillor in the Governor General in Council was a law member. And who was this law member? You know it, right? It's Lord Macaulay. Lord Macaulay was the law member. He was a professional jurist, a lawyer, who was required to codify laws now. We see Charter Act of 1793 used to regulate the business and administration of the company via regulations, but now the Charter Act of 1833, it required Law Macaulay to legislate laws, codify laws. He was allowed to sit in every meeting and could even cast votes with respect to the drafting of those meetings presenting a legal code. So when we talk about Lord Macaulay, he was introduced as a fourth member of a law member. We will see that there was a formation of law commission. So a law commission was established for codification of laws. So we see after Charter Act of 1833, we won't say it's a Regulation Act. It is an act. It was called as a act. Previous to Charter Act of 1833, it was called regulation. For example, regulation number 17, abolition of sati. But Act of 1841-42, it would be abolition of slavery. So post 1833, it would be called as Act because there was a law member who was introduced as a fourth councillor. He was only required to vote as a law expert, but not as a regular councillor. But still, he played a very important role in codification of laws, and he headed the Law Commission as well. Now, all the other presidencies, whether it is Bengal, whether it is Madras, whether it is Bombay, all the three presidencies, they lost their legislative powers. They could only recommend a particular subject to the Governor General in Council. So a complete internal centralization. So I would say a complete internal centralization became the hallmark of the Charter Act of 1833. The most important provision of the Charter Act of 1833 was Section 87. Section 87 of the Charter Act of 1833 truly reflected the spirit of utilitarianism. Section 87, it did away with all forms of disqualification on the basis of race, color, place of birth, descent, religion. It clearly stated that any Indian or natural born citizen in the British territory would not be disqualified to occupy any highest office merely because of religion, race, color, place of birth, descent. So it was a progressive provision. So Section 87 is considered as an important aspect with respect to Charter Act of 1833. But was it implemented? No. Yes, Section 87 was indeed progressive, utilitarian, liberal in character. It did away with Cornwallis prejudice, which was the hallmark of Charter Act of 1793. However, the Section 87 was yet to be implemented as there were no provisions introduced with respect to appointment of Indians. So the Indians would have to wait for another 20 years when competitive civil services examinations will be introduced via Charter Act of 1853. So when we talk about Section 87, it is characterized by removal of disqualification. So if I consider the spirit of utilitarianism, which was the hallmark of Charter Act of 1833, we see that with time, it's not that all other thoughts, they were losing their effect altogether, but they were shaping the idea of British Raj. Orientalism under Warren Hastings produced a false knowledge of India. It was studying of India's past by foreigners which suited their needs to show India in poor light, which will form the basis to racial superiority claimed by the British, which found expression in the form of Anglicism, Anglicist thought. And this Anglicist thought, in the form of white man's burden, it blended with Christian humanism and evangelical principles which justified British rule in India. In fact, it's important to understand that prior to the introduction of Charter Act of 1813, Charles Grant wanted to introduce one provision that British rule in India is for the moral upliftment of Indians, moral and spiritual upliftment of Indians. So prior to Charter Act of 1813, the Britishers, they wanted to project themselves as emancipators, as missionaries with a mission to emancipate Indians. So we see there was an intermixture of Anglicism and evangelicalism, and then ultimately utilitarianism. So by the time period of 1830s and 40s, the British rule with the ideology of white man burden, a spirit of racial superiority, racial discrimination, and with reformist trend of liberalism, started emerging or started imposing paternal despotism. So whenever we consider the emergence of paternal despotism, it was the outcome of decades of rule characterized by Orientalism, Anglicism, evangelicalism, utilitarianism, and which ultimately gave rise to the ideology of British Raj. The Charter Act of 1833 occupies a very important, prominent position in shaping the ideology of British Raj.